So, hey folks, Emma Cape, who is in your grid there, she'll be our moderator for this evening. We're happy to have her. Emma worked with me on the Bradley Chelsea Manning campaign for a number of years, so she can be trusted.
Hey, Emma.
Hey, good to see you, Siri. Sure. All right. So as James mentioned, as we go along here, people will be able to add their questions to the chat box. And we've got some time set aside at the end to answer questions. So I'm going to go ahead and mute. See, oh, it went away. Did you hit mute already, James? Sorry.
No, but I think most folks are muted now.
Okay, great. Well, we can go ahead and start. I'd seen a button and then it just...
Oh, I see. There are three more
fine.
people joining us, so you might wait like 30 more seconds.
Okay, sure.
Okay, I think that. Okay, I think everyone's in at this moment, and I'll keep letting them in as more come.
Okay, great. Yeah, so if everyone can just mute yourself when you're not talking, will be great as we go along here. So welcome everybody to tonight's activist training. What do you say to National Guard members facing orders to deploy against anti-racist protesters? Thanks very much for joining us. My name is Emma Cape. As Jeff mentioned, I work with Courage to Resist, and I'm delighted to be your moderator this evening. This training is being hosted by the Military Law Task Force, as well as the National Lawyers Guild, with the support of the GI Rights Hotline, About Face, Veterans Against War, Veterans for Peace, Courage to Resist, and the Center on Conscientious and War. So these are the folks you want to know if you're wanting to be active on this topic. Before we move on, we have two housekeeping matters we want to mention. So first, we are going to be recording this presentation for future use, so that if you know someone who wants to be at this training but wasn't able to join tonight, please let them know that we'll be posting the recording on, the URL is nlgnltf.org, and we can put that in the chat box as well, so you have that URL. Also, to control background noise, we've mentioned this, but we are going to be muting everyone's microphones if we have issues with background noise. However, if you have questions that come up in the meantime, feel free to put them in the chat box, and then at the end, we're going to have plenty of time for a Q&A. So moving on, we'll first hear from Siri Margerin of the GI Rights Network, who will frame for us the historic moment we're currently living in. And then after that, a few of our advocacy organization partners will have 2 to 3 minutes each to introduce their related efforts and the relevant resources. This will be followed by the primary presentation by Military Law Task Force Attorney James Branum, which will be approximately 20 minutes. And finally, at the end, our remaining time will be for questions and answers. So with that, Siri Margerin, please tell us a little more about yourself and the work you do.
Sure. My name is Siri. I live in San Francisco. I go by she and her pronouns, and this is a Lonnie territory. So anyway, I actually am a counselor on the GI Rights Hotline. I am on the board of About Face. I am an adjunct member of Vets for Peace and of the Military Law Task Force. So I'm kind of, this is my political home, I guess you could say. So that's me. And I want to talk just a little bit about this moment. It's going to be very brief. I will start with a quote. People finally see it. White people too. My brother's going to change the world. Those are the words of George Floyd's younger brother, Philanese. And I devoutly hope that that is true, because his life was taken from him, and we'd like that to be an end to that. And there is a 21st century Black freedom movement, the movement for Black lives, which has been, they and others, radical thinkers and organizers, have spent years building the analysis the relationships and the infrastructure to meet this moment. So they are going to lead us into the transformed world we dream of, we deserve, and we are now demanding. Defund the police, defend Black life. And they are the reason, I mean, they will, and they are already making sure that George Floyd is going to change the world, that his death is going to change the world. So I am deeply grateful for their brilliance, dedication, and the leadership, and grateful that for everything that they have already accomplished, which if you look at what's happening, it is amazing. I mean, I'm reluctant to, throw all my hopes into a big basket and go, yes, we did it. But I do feel like we have an opportunity now. And so it's really important that we're here tonight, and that we are going to be backing up those amazing accomplishments by our brothers and sisters who have led this movement and are in the streets. So I am grateful to all of you for showing up here tonight and for showing up in this work. It's really important. And this call is a triage session. It's not a full-on GI rights training. We want you to leave here with a clear understanding of the various skills and resources and expertise that people from all these different groups bring to the table. And so that we can do our best work together in supporting service members in defending Black lives and in facing their own moral conflicts and addressing options for, National Guard troops and others in other services. And I hope also that this is going to bring us together in a way that we can continue to build these organizations and the work that we do until we are no longer needed. And boy, I'll be happy to retire when that moment comes. So we're going to introduce the groups present and exchange resources and talk about how we can support each other. And one thing is, don't expect to leave tonight prepared to be a GI rights counselor. You will leave tonight prepared to be part of this body of people who together will be able to answer everyone's questions and support everyone who needs help. That's my blah, blah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Siri, for sharing all about your inspiring work and your thoughts on this moment. We deeply appreciate everything you do. Since this is an activist training, like Siri mentioned, we also want to make sure folks are aware of the efforts of our ally organizations and the resources they're providing to troops who may be questioning orders. Organizers, this is just a friendly reminder to please limit your presentations to 2 to 3 minutes so that we have some time for Q&A at the end. So first, I would like to introduce Veterans Against War.
Okay, About Face Veterans Against the War used to be Iraq Veterans Against the War. So just for folks who are familiar, About Face has a peer-to-peer support network, which can be accessed at support@aboutfaceveterans.org. And that is for service members. That's an entry point for service members to talk with other, with veterans, young veterans who have been there and can relate to their problems with their questions of conscience, their questions of what is possible, and just to really have the fallback of someone who has already worn their shoes. All right, so that's the main thing. About Face has also been working very closely with members of M4 Movement for Black Lives, so it is also a place to be certain to send troops who might need the kind of support of talking with folks who are involved in that movement. So I guess that's, and is there anyone who doesn't know that About Face is post 9/11 veterans against the war? So just figuring I should add that.
Great. So next we have Veterans for Peace. And I have a note here that that would be either Garrett or Jerry. So I guess which either of you are prepared to talk?
Yeah, no problem. Jerry contacted me earlier and asked me to speak for Veterans for Peace. When Jerry was the president of the board, they hired me almost a year ago today. So my name's Garett Reppenhagen. I'm the executive director of Veterans for Peace. We've been around since 1985, you know, fighting to speak truth to power and bring the consequences of war, the truth of war to light. I served in Iraq as a sniper with the 1st Infantry Division as a cavalry scout, and I served in Kosovo. I was the first active duty member of Iraq Veterans Against the War. I'm still a member of About Face and Veterans Against War. And yeah, we're working on Stand Down for Black Lives campaign to get the National Guard and the military to refuse orders to force governors to not deploy National Guard. And through that effort with About Face and a coalition of other groups, we're starting to get calls. I've probably spoke to about a dozen, maybe a half dozen military members trying to get out of military service, not mobilize, not deploy. So we realize that there's definitely a need to build a stronger network of resources for service members who are looking for better options, especially better options than deploying into their home communities and oppress protesters and diminish their First Amendment rights. So we're building a peer support network as well. We're asking folks to contact Stand Down at veteransforpeace.org to get a hold of our group. And we're looking at ways to kind of merge our resources and merge our efforts so we're all kind of united and working together. We're going to put a call out for members to sign up to go through training through the GI Rights Hotline and become well-trained volunteers. And hopefully we can build this out. I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Garrett. Next on the list, we have the Center on Conscience and War, represented by Bill Galvin.
Hello, everyone. Maria apologizes she's not here. She's under the weather this evening. But the Center on Conscience and War is actually, we're part of the GI Rights Hotline. We're one of the founding groups. And so we take the calls the GI Rights Hotline gets and address all the various things that probably we're going to talk about tonight. Our specialty, of course, is conscientious objection. We were founded in 1940 to support conscientious objectors because of how badly they were treated during World War I, and we continue with that. And that includes people resisting and objecting to the draft, even though that's not our issue tonight, but just be aware that we can address that as well. The most relevant for our work related to this right now in terms of conscientious objection, I assume James is going to talk about this, but once somebody submits their application for conscientious objector status, they have some protections that the command is supposed to accommodate their beliefs as much as possible. So that's one of the things that we are working on. But yeah, we're just the part of the struggle and happy to be here.
Thank you, Bill. Now we have Courage to Resist, presented by Jeff Paterson.
All right, I'm unmuted. Thanks, Emma. Well, 30 years ago, I was a Marine artillery guy, and I made a life-altering decision to refuse to kill people in Iraq. That was August 1990. I've been part of the Courage to Resist organizing collective for about half of that 30 years, since 2005 or so. We've defended dozens of military objectors. We take a very broad definition of what an objector is: conscientious objector, war resistor. and try to help them as best we can, oftentimes organizing various communities around the country to do so. We have supported dozens of military members directly at military court-martials around the country, often many of those cases in the 2007-8 period. We worked directly with our MLTF presenter tonight, Attorney James Branum, and we're honored to continue to be working with him all this time later. We are kind of best probably well known for taking responsibility and successfully defending the life of Chelsea Manning, saving her a lifetime in federal prison, and she's alive today and free, in large part to the many people on this network and their support over those years. My personal view is, well, Courage Resist tried to sound the alarm about 2 years ago about Trump using military people on U.S. soil for one of the first times in history at the southern border. That was a trial run for him. This last week, he's upped that, and there's a real possibility that this won't be the last time. What happens in November if Trump refuses to accept the will of the people and leave? I can easily imagine, tens of thousands of people surrounding the White House, and then once again, military troops and various police forces, then again ordered to protect Trump in his bunker. So, that might have sounded far-fetched a few years ago, but now it almost seems like the most likely outcome. So those are things we're worried about. We do believe very strongly in informed resistance. We try to push the envelope politically to support people to refuse to fight for war and empire. And yet, unless they really know what they're getting into, they're not served very well, and the movement isn't served in the long run at all either. So that's my spiel. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Jeff. Another organization we wanted to present to you is the Civilian Medical Resources Network. Nobody from that organization is on our call tonight, but we wanted to share with you a little more information about them. So the Civilian Medical Resources Network helps address the unmet medical and psychological needs of U.S. military personnel who contact the GI Rights Hotline. CMRN, as they're also called, is composed of professionals and volunteers who are located across the U.S. Due to GI's limited financial resources and insurance coverage for civilian services, CMRN professionals provide care free of charge. When possible, GIs visit CMRN professionals in person. If an in-person visit isn't possible due to geographic distance, CMRN professionals will assist GIs by telephone consultations. CMRN is expanding their outreach to peace organizations, professional organizations, and especially GIs. Except for a part-time paid coordinator and people who do outreach to GIs, all people working with CMRN serve as volunteers. All paid staff members are veterans or family members of veterans. So if you'd like to get in touch with CMRN, you can find more on their website.
And there is a CMRN member on the call tonight, Ann Galvin.
Apologies, my apologies. So Ann, would you like to add anything to what I just said?
I'm trying to. You covered it pretty much. These are volunteer therapists, but they also use some lay medical people to do intake interviews, and that's something they're looking for. And Howard Watson is sort of in charge of the whole thing and devotes his life to it. So we have seen very good results from it. The evaluations that come to them come with a diagnosis, a recommendation for treatment, and usually a recommendation that this person needs to be discharge. And of course, the command can ignore all that since it comes from civilians, but it does make a difference. So if you have people that are in need of a second opinion after they hear from what's going on from their base clinic, this would be the place to go.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Hugely important work. Thank you, Anne. And if people have more questions for Anne at the end, of course, we'll be taking questions then. So next, I'd like to introduce James Branum, who's an attorney with the Military Law Task Force. During the early days of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, James traveled the country defending military objectives to endless war for empire. James, what do activists need to know when talking to National Guard and active duty troops questioning their orders today, especially in this current context of military repression and dissent?
Thank you, Emma. First, is everything hearing me okay? Does it sound okay?
You got some thumbs up.
Okay, good. Sorry, I've had a little bit of computer difficulties tonight, so I just want to double check. Well, thank you so much for everyone who's watching tonight. It means a lot to me, especially seeing so many dear friends and veterans of the peace movement who have been doing this work for so long, and really honored that we get to have this event. And also I'm really excited about the chance that this to be shared later in other contexts so that we can continue to build what I'm calling this triage level of initial engagement with service members. Before we go on, though, to our topic at hand, I do want to briefly mention the Military Law Task Force of the National Lawyers Guild is one of the other organizations. Kathy Gilbert would have done this introduction, but she's not well today. So I just want to mention that the MLTF, we are part of the National Lawyers Guild, an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist law association. We are an organization with lawyers and legal workers, and we do a lot of different things, but I would say what we do in this context is two things. First of all is training and scholarship, helping to formulate thoughtful responses to what's going on, and particularly resources for legal practitioners, that there's really no one else putting this out. The second thing that we do is attorney referrals. And if any of you from the hotline have ever needed an attorney, you know, call Kathy Gilbert and she can get you set up. And what the MLTF tries to do when possible is to have multiple attorneys that they can refer to, so that if a service member in a particular location calls, when possible, we try to give them more than one choice, so to empower the client to pick something that works for them. But that's really our two big things I would see in this context that we deal with. So in talking about this subject, and as we've mentioned earlier, this is a triage level training. And triage is a term borrowed from the medical community, which is about the effective routing of resources to a crisis at hand. The idea is that we need to be able to get people to the right people in a timely fashion, but also to be effective in this and to make sure no one is dropped, no one is left behind. And so in this, what we're really focusing on is the idea that many of you in your organizing, in your work, we are expecting that many of you will be the frontline people engaging with members of the National Guard, whether it's in your local community, whether it is at a Black Lives Matter protest, whether it's someone calling you, needing help. We're expecting that a lot of folks in the activist community are going to be approached by folks, and so we want to give you some resources to know where to plug people into who need help. And secondly, what are other principles you might want to consider, particularly in that initial stage when a service member may be terrified, may feel like they have very few options, to at least have a little bit of a roadmap to help someone and then to route them in the direction they need for help. So with that said, I'm going to give a very quick and dirty a discussion of some of the legal issues in National Guard cases in our current context. One of the biggies, first and foremost, is jurisdiction, the issue of state versus federal control. National Guard members who are on SAD, state active duty orders, or Title 32 orders are generally subject to state law, state regulations. Normally the state's version of the UCMJ. For instance, I think in Oklahoma it's called the Oklahoma Military Code. Every state has a little bit different terminology. It's usually similar, but not identical to the federal rules. But moreover, probably the biggie is that what happens in a court-martial in a state context is very different than a federal context, and the penalties are different. Thankfully, in most cases, the penalties are lighter in the state context, but not always. So that's one huge issue, is jurisdiction. Another issue that's important in National Guard cases is the part-time nature of this kind of service. Many members of the Guard live very complicated lives, often working full-time jobs when not on their Guard duties. This also means that many more members of the Guard tend to be engaged in activism in their daily lives, simply because they have time away from the military to think and to process things. And so the odds are, if you've been to Black Lives Matter protests in those last few weeks, you've probably encountered, whether you knew it or not, members of the National Guard who are there because they want to be there, who are not, not there on duty, but are there because they believe in the mission. And so again, it's a very part-time, hybrid kind of relationship. Of the boundary line between civilian and military is a little more blurry in the Guard context. A third major difference in the Guard context is that there tends to be, but I will say this is a generalization, there tends to be more commitment to a unit. Unlike active duty members who tend to be moved around in a more willy-nilly fashion sometimes, Guard members tend to stay in their units longer, which can complicate things for a lot of reasons, particularly the emotional side of things. Because if you've served with someone for 5 years, you're going to have a closer connection to someone you served with just a few months. A fourth major difference in National Guard cases is that the health issues can be very tricky, because Guard members have limited access to medical benefits and often have other complicating factors. One of the things to remember is National Guard members are scattered across the country. Many of them are located in rural areas, which means they are not close to a lot of medical resources that someone who might be stationed in an active duty military context might have, or even just might be in a big city in the civilian world. Finally, major difference in National Guard cases are that the penalties for resistance sometimes are easier, but not always. And so there's some complexity here. What we can do to help, and I'm going to talk very briefly about a few generalities, and then we're going to move into the hypotheticals. So what can we do to help? And I should begin by saying, when I say we, I'm specifically talking about the people on this. I think we have around 30 or 40 folks on here today. And so of these folks, about 2/3 of you are activist advocates who are not also attorneys or GI rights counselors. And also we have some people who used to do GI rights counsel work who are not now. So about a third of you are attorneys or GI rights counselors. And for you all, I will tell you, you're not included in the we I'm speaking about here. If you're a GI rights counselor or a lawyer, you can do things that non-lawyers and non-GI rights counselors can't or shouldn't do. So I'm really tonight focusing on the folks who are not lawyers, not GI rights counselors. But it's important because these folks who are not those two roles still can do a tremendous amount of work, can really make a difference in these cases. And so I'm focusing on them. But if you're an attorney or GI rights counselor and you're saying, hey, I want more training on National Guard issues, more in depth, we are putting, I think on Tuesday it's going to be happening, we are doing a training on that. I'm still working on a few logistical details, but I will email everyone afterwards who wants that kind of training. But that's specifically geared for attorneys and GI rights counselors. So tonight, though, we're talking about everybody else. What can we do? First and foremost, when you're talking to someone in these crisis situations, we can listen and we can mirror. Mirroring is a technique I've learned from a counselor years ago, and I've used it over and over again as an attorney. I've used it in personal relationships. It's the idea of letting someone else talk, and then you mirror back to them. You say, I think what you've said is this. And the idea is that you're listening to them, you're affirming them in their processing, and you're helping them to just know someone is listening. The key here with the mirroring concept, particularly for those of us who are not veterans, is not making the mistake of saying, oh, I totally get what you're going through. I understand. Well, that's a lie, because I'm not a veteran. I don't know really what they're going through. And so the mirroring, instead of saying, if I were in your shoes, I could see how you would feel this way. It's helping them to process things. So that's the first part, being a friend, fundamentally. Second thing is triage. In other words, what we're doing in triage is we're asking, is this a situation that is going to be blowing up in the next few days? Or is it somewhere down the road? Is it a month from now? Is it in the hypothetical distant future? And we'll talk about this a little bit in hypotheticals, but the strategies one may use is going to be completely different depending on this urgency issue. Who you route them to may be very different. And then finally, the third part of this, and we're going to talk about this briefly tonight, is also many service members in a crisis situation, before they even will call the GI Rights Hotline, they're immediately jumping to crazy conclusions. Or that's not a good word, I won't use crazy, but maybe extreme conclusions. They think their choice is either I refuse orders and go to jail, or I do whatever they tell me to do. And so one of the things anyone can do is encourage someone in this crisis situation to say, no, you got lots of options, and they may not be obvious to you right now, but that's why I'm encouraging you to call the GI Rights Hotline. That's why I'm getting you in touch with this other organization, so that it can spark more creativity. So now I think it's a good time for us to transition over into talking about our hypotheticals. And for these, what I will do, and these are on the Google document we sent just a little bit ago. Let me pull this up. And I need to make it so I can see you all, but also see the thing I'm reading. So okay, there we go. So what I'm going to do is we'll read each of the hypotheticals, and then we'll take about 5 minutes or so to talk about them. And so anyone who has comments, thoughts on it, unmute yourself. And what we're doing in these hypotheticals is we're imagining if we were on the other side, this is our friend, this is the person that we are engaging with, what we would say in engaging with them. So here's our hypothetical. By the way, on these hypotheticals, these are composites. I based them on some of my cases and other people's cases, but we've changed the identifying information, obviously, to preserve confidentiality. These are meant, though, to kind of be typical cases, as typical as anything can ever be in this. Okay, so hypothetical number 1. We have a private first class, PFC John Doe. He's a member of the Wyoming Army National Guard and has served there for the last 3 years. Private Doe is the first member of his family to go to college, so he thought joining the Guard would help him pay for it. In this case, it kind of did, because they gave him a $10,000 signing bonus. By the way, we'll talk about this later. That will complicate things a bit, but he got the bonus. He also assumed that being from Wyoming, that there's little chance he would ever be deployed. He thought, hey, I'm doing my job, you know. He wasn't really taking it seriously. And this is, by the way, not uncommon. Lots of people in the similar situation do that. Private Doe has generally been happy with his time in the Guard and enjoys the camaraderie of drill weekends. There are some weird people like that who do that, who enjoy it, and he's one of them. At the same time, though, this is talking about the complexity of Guard members' life. He's also active in a white ally group in his college town that has been supporting the Black Lives Matter protest in his community. He knows that people in his unit wouldn't approve of this, but he just keeps it on the down low, because he believes, in his words, that it's his patriotic duty to speak out for those who are being mistreated. So one evening around 1800, 6 p.m., he got a text from his NCO which said, quote, "We are going to be shipping out to DC to help with crowd control. Everyone needs to be at the armory at 0500 tomorrow to get our gear ready and to be ready to catch the bus at 0800. John is very upset. And when he's talking to his friends and loved one, he said he doesn't want to go, but he doesn't want to go to jail either. And he really doesn't even want to quit the military. But he never envisioned this kind of mission. So before making a decision on his next steps, he calls us, his old friends. And what are we going to do in this scenario? So who would like to give this a stab of how would you talk to him? Who would you route him to? And you can feel free to unmute yourself. You can also answer through chat, whatever's easiest. Bill?
Yeah, I would advise him that he has rights and does not have to deploy or serve. I would tell him to stand down.
Okay.
And already supported by organizations that will back him up. You know, that's what I would tell him.
Okay. William, the first part I especially like, emphasizing that he has rights. That is always an important thing to remind him about. Now, I will mention the second part is where it gets complicated for some of us. especially for the lawyer folks on this call, because we legally can't tell people to break the law. If we do, we could face ethics violations and criminal charges. Everyone else could still face criminal charges. Is that likely? No. But is it possible? Yes. So many people choose, instead of talking in that kind of way, may say, legally, if you disobey these orders, you could face penalties for that, but there are groups that support you. In other words, emphasizing that yes, this is illegal, but there could be consequences.
We have a couple of answers from Raleigh in the chat here too. Raleigh says, are there others in your unit that might feel the same way as you? And have you talked to your outside group allies of your thoughts on this service?
Ooh, those are good. I like that a lot, Raleigh. Now, does anyone have thoughts on what would be the first organization, if you're going to refer them to this soldier to someone, who would you potentially refer them to first? William?
Definitely Veterans for Peace.
Veterans for
You know,
Peace.
without blinking an eye.
Okay.
Veteransforpeace.org. You know, that would be the first organization. Since I am a member of 2 chapters, I would definitely have them contact Veterans for Peace, and then yeah, that's my first choice.
Okay. What other thoughts do folks have?
Well, to me, the obvious one would be the GI Rights Network, and Siri could tell us more about that. We kind of skipped over that intro. And, you know, I would try to get to, if I knew him a little bit better, I'd certainly introduce him to the About Face, Veterans Against the War, for a more peer-to-peer counseling experience, if he was open to that in a political context.
Mm-hmm.
Dan Shea with Veterans for Peace Portland. I've been faced with this a few times in the past, and one thing I learned is that I can't give legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. So I would say, look, I'm not a lawyer, but I am a veteran. And if you're in my area, if you like, we can sit down and talk. And we can talk about this, and I do have options for you. There are a number of groups that can help.
Excellent. What are some of the needs that you think that this service member might be facing right now? In other words, what are problems, obstacles that they might be facing?
It seems to me that this person needs to maybe get some idea of what the options of penalty is going to be if he does this. It's very good that he doesn't show up, but it would be good if he understood what some of the repercussions might be.
Mm-hmm. And that's where I would be inclined to say the GI Rights Hotline would be a first step, but then very, very likely, particularly if he's the place of actually considering resistance, in that scenario, then I would be looking at Veterans for Peace, Courage to Resist, some of the others. I would say one big issue in his case, though, is his goal at this moment is to stay in. He does not want to go on this mission. And that is a complicated scenario, but it is also not uncommon. And so for that kind of scenario, the reason I'd especially point him towards the GI Rights Hotline is we may need to be creative, meaning outright objection may be an issue. He's someone who doesn't, at this moment, is saying he could continue to serve in the military. So he may not be a CO. He might be. He just hasn't probed this enough yet. But I would say one of the questions I'd be wanting to probe into is that what other stuff do you have going on in your life? Do you have health issues, physical, mental health issues? Do you have family hardship issues? Do you have issues with your family care plan? If you're coming up on an activation? All of these are questions you'd want to probe. In other words, as much as for you and I, we may love to see everyone walk off the job, resist openly, that may not be this guy's path, but his path may be something else that means he's not going to be on the front line. of this. And so there are multiple ways of pushing back. One thing too, I'll mention that has not been talked a lot about in other contexts, and I'm aware of, but I also think a lot about some of the creative things people did who were not happy with their deployment, but were not willing yet to outright refuse. And I'm thinking about the Vietnam era, where that many people found different ways, such as search and avoid missions, such as deciding I'm not going to shoot my gun. And that's something I've discussed with my clients. I've told them legally, I can't tell you to break the law, but what I can tell you is that the consequences of shooting people that you don't want to shoot are going to be lifelong, impactful issues. And we can talk, as a lawyer, we can talk about the ethical, moral implications, not just the legal stuff. And the same thing in your context, that while you may not tell someone outright you should refuse, you can, but you may face penalties for that. What you can always do is talk through moral, ethical implications.
And James, you have a couple more
James?
questions in the
Sure.
chat you might want to address. So from Nick Hill, Nick says, do we inform PFCs to inform his chain of command and let them know his objections and let them know he is not showing it? So I think this is related to everything you're saying, but I thought you might want to address that.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Well, on this gets into some tactical territory. In other words, if he was, say, applying for conscientious objector status, then probably so. But ideally, he'd be doing so with a completed application in his hand. If he, in other contexts, it may or may not make sense to inform his command about him having objections. Really, my suggestion, he needs to talk to the GI Rights Hotline and other groups first to sort out what it is he actually wants to do here. As far as not showing up, that is against the law. So what we cannot tell him, you should not show up. What we can do is say the consequences of not showing up are unknown. It's going to depend on state law, but potentially we're dealing with multiple possible charges. Not showing up for an activation, and by the way, in the Guard context, usually called activations rather than deployments, but not showing up for an activation, at worst case scenario, could be considered to be missing movement. It could be considered to be desertion. The issue being is that you're not where you're supposed to be, you don't have permission to not be there, and they could argue you have the intent to shirk hazardous duty, which it satisfies the intent elements of desertion. So it's not an insignificant charge. Now, what complicates things a bit in the National Guard context is the command could choose to instead treat it as simply unsatisfactory participation, which is the equivalent of not showing up for your drill weekend. And if you miss enough drills, you can be separated out just on that. It's a terrible gamble, though, because the command could choose to approach it that way, but they also could choose to approach it in a more punitive way. Okay, we had another question here from Raleigh McLemore that says, depends a bit on whether the person feels that he needs a legal way to approach his concerns or whether the service member is thinking more broadly of opposition of this exact problem. Depends a lot on the person and how they describe their objections and concerns. Absolutely. One thing I'll mention from the GI Rights Hotline side of things, when I did training some years ago, I remember someone sharing that just because someone calls us and they say the problem is this, that may not be the real problem. They may have a whole bunch of other problems that they don't have the words to get to explain quite yet. And so a skilled GI rights counselor or skilled attorney can help someone to sort it out and to find out what really is the problem. Or maybe the real thing is this moral crisis, but your ticket out of the Army is going to be this health issue. And so it is complicated. Okay, another question, Jerry Condon asked, what if she was also concerned about her duty to refuse illegal orders? That is a great, great question. In the handout, the link we posted earlier, there is a link there to an article we have a couple articles actually on point. One is Military Policies on Dissent by David Guestpass. The other one is not, it's called, I wrote it a few years ago, it's called Deployed to the Border, A Test of Conscience for GIs. That was specifically talking about the border deployments. We spent a fair bit of time in that article talking about illegal orders. Under military law, it is a defense to a crime to the crime of disobeying an order if the order was unlawful. Here's the problem. The regulations and the UCMJ and all the interpretive stuff, what it makes it clear is that the service member refuses an illegal order at their own risk, meaning that we're asking a private first class, in this case, to judge whether a war and a particular action in the war is illegal or illegal. The courts have said that the presumption is always that the military orders are lawful. So in other words, the burden of proof is on the defendant to prove that the order was in fact illegal. And the problem is many of the orders that these service members are facing may be legal under domestic law, but may be illegal under international law, for instance. It's a very tricky territory. All this to say that I've had clients over the years who this has been very meaningful to them personally to resist an illegal order, but to be actually successful in winning on those grounds as a defense is very, very difficult. Okay, we have another question. Arthur Heitzer says, any basis to consider the option of accepting the deployment but raising questions/objections then with his fellow reservists? This is certainly something to think about. I mean, especially given the fact of Guard units being sometimes people who've known each other for more years. It's also, I will say, Guard members, they may be more likely to engage with each other outside the workplace as well. So for these reasons, there always are some possibilities for that kind of collective work. That said, military regulations are pretty punitive on the issue of collective bargaining for grievances. The military is by law forbidden to organize from a labor context. And so there are some complexities here, but it's certainly something to think about. Okay, let's see, Daniel Shea said, the person is dealing with a moral dilemma. There may be a faith group. And that is an excellent, excellent, excellent point. I will mention CCW is really good at connecting people with different faith communities, but also one thing I would encourage everyone is we can nurture relationships with different faith communities that have a peace orientation. Often one is to connect service members who need those who may be from those traditions, but may just not know who to talk to. But also sometimes I've encountered folks who may be alienated from the religion of their upbringing, but are seeking to find some kind of, they're still framing things religiously, but they're disconnected from the religion of their upbringing. And so I've encouraged my clients at least sometimes to consider connecting with a community that does work for them, not the one they grew up with. So I always joke, I have a client, I call him my Buddhist convert, because he on his deployment really engaged with Buddhist thinking. So I encouraged him, he got back, I said, look, you need support. Why don't you get involved with the Buddhist community? And before long, he's a very active, engaged member. So these kinds of social supports in various ways can be helpful. At the same time, that's not for everyone. A growing number of people are not religious, and especially among the younger generation, definitely so. And so just because someone's framing things morally, ethically, they may not be religious. And so for those kind of issues, I do say CCW is who I very often send people to. Okay, Raleigh asked, during the Vietnam War, we would always clarify a person who is not returning to duty as AWOL, but announcing, quote, I will never go back to service, unquote. In those days, at least, that might make the military, okay, we were always able to explain to the person we were talking to them that it would be theoretically possible to return to service if things were different. This generally led to AWOL charges and protected counsel as well from federal charges. Okay, I think what I think we'll reword that a little bit. I think what he's saying is that that specifically desertion is AWOL, absence without permission, plus those intent elements of either intent to remain away forever or intent to shirk hazardous duty. The good news is in this Guard context, the intent to remain away forever probably not an issue because the Guard member is probably planning to come back to drill at some point. But intent to shirk hazardous duty would be an issue because the military could argue this kind of deployment is hazardous duty. Now, as a lawyer, I would argue about whether this is in fact hazardous duty, but we really don't want to have to go there. It's better to avoid this issue altogether. It gets tricky. Okay, William said, this may be their first deployment. Family and financial concerns may prevent them from deploying. That is another excellent point. This is why digging into these related issues is important. Now, we've been talking about this in a very all over the place way, but the key thing here is that in this role, in this triage role, our job is not to have all the answers. Our job is to help someone sort things out and then connect them to those who can help them to connect. Okay, Ann posted, facing a moral issue, when it is effective to suggest reporting but not shooting the gun or shooting over heads. Also, Bill posted, and don't forget community hardship. Bill, could you say something about that, the community hardship? I'm going to unmute you, if I can.
Okay.
There we go.
Yeah, no, there are regulations that say that if you are a necessary person in your community, historically it's applied to like police officers and firefighters that were being sent off to Afghanistan. It's like, well, then we won't have a fire department in our community, so we can get exempted from it. The only thing I've heard about recently where that worked was somebody who was a medical worker and it was really essential with the COVID-19 in their neighborhood, and they were able to avoid the call up that way. But there are provisions that if you are a necessary person in your community, you could be exempted from the call up.
Bill, are those regulations, are they federal, are they state? Where do we find those?
Pretty sure they're federal.
Okay, and they're probably branch specific, or are they?
I think it's in the DOD, but I'd have to double check.
Okay. I'm going to make a note here because we need, that's one we'll need to explore for the Tuesday training coming up. So, well, looking at the time, I think we need to move to our second hypothetical, but we can continue. If we have more comments, we certainly can go there. But let's go ahead and read our second hypothetical, a little bit different situation. Okay, hypothetical number 2. Sergeant Jane Smith is a member of the Delaware Army National Guard with a very limited time left before her contract is up. But unfortunately, she gets a call from her first sergeant telling her that she needs to start texting her people under her and telling them to report to the Army, to the Armory, I should have said, Armory, for an activation in 4 days. Sergeant Smith is not happy about this order, in part because she doesn't like the idea of domestic activation like this, but also because she is still experiencing back pain from an injury she suffered during last year's annual summer training. She is also worried about issues of childcare while she is gone, as her husband is working in another state on an oil rig. If he comes home, they can't pay the mortgage, but she doesn't see she has any other options. So what thoughts do we have on how we would engage with this person? Well, the first thing I would say, oh, go ahead.
Oh, hi, James. It's Jerry here. Well, it seems like she has a number of issues that are worth further exploration. One would be that she would be exempted because of her current disability, the back pain. Mm-hmm. Another would be that she's an essential parent and her child needs her. So it seems like both of those would be avenues to pursue, among others. She's also unhappy with the whole idea of this deployment, so she could take, but she has a number, even if it's a moral issue for her primarily, she still has other ways that she might be able to legally avoid the deployment, or at least escape punishment for doing so.
Mm-hmm. I'll admit that this hypothetical, I made this one an easy one because we stated the issues right up front. Normally, this is not how folks come to us. Normally, Sergeant Smith in this case might have said, I'm really may focus on one issue, but you have to have a long conversation to get out all these other factors. But it's not uncommon to have folks with multiple good avenues for relief here. And in her case, as Jerry has talked about, there are multiple things. We have a physical health issue. We have childcare issues. We have, of course, she's not happy with this deployment itself. But the great thing in this situation is that she has some really good bona fide things that can be documented. The challenging thing here in this hypothetical, though, is the timing. She has 4 days. That would make it very difficult. Okay, let's move on to hypothetical number 3. This last one, Siri, were you raising your hand? Sorry, I thought you were raising your hand.
I was.
Okay,
I was
go for it.
thinking about the fact that she has 4 days to do it, and maybe the one thing that she could also do is just to get in touch with her command. That would probably be a first. Well, I would say call the hotline, but then also get in touch with her command and just ask them if there's any, because of her family situation, because of her still having back pain, if maybe she can just be excused from this one. Sometimes the most simple next step is can be successful.
Mm-hmm. One thing I'll mention on this scenario with a physical health issue, and I should have made a hypothetical about this, but I have seen cases where you have a very short time period before an activation, but the service member may, between when they get the order and when they actually show up, may have a serious health crisis, such as a mental breakdown, such as some other physical health complication. And so one thing that I often have suggested folks to consider is to try to get admitted to a hospital, especially, say, immediately before the deployment. There's a few advantages of that. One, of course, is that the military, it's hard to argue that they are absent if they legally can't make it, if they physically can't make it there. And if a doctor has said, we want you to stay in this hospital because you're acutely suicidal, it's going to be very difficult to prosecute someone for that. Not impossible. They could still say it's malingering and all of that, but it's difficult. Another advantage, of course, is just safety. Is for someone one of the things, and we haven't talked about this yet, but one of the dangers for particularly a young adult is sometimes of the black and white thinking, of thinking the choice is I must resist, or I'm going to violate my conscience, or I'm going to hurt myself. And unfortunately, many people jump to that third one really quickly if they don't know that, no, there's option 4 and number 5 and number 6. But in those kind of, I would suggest these crisis situations to ask someone, is there any chance that, where are you at? And primarily to gauge, is there any chance of self-destructive behavior? And if so, then to take appropriate precautions. Okay, we got some more comments coming in on the chat. I'm going to read them. Siri makes a really good point. She says, it is our job to make sure we are not misleading anyone ever. So if you aren't sure, don't say it. I would also add to this, one very important thing is to always make it clear of where you're coming from. And so I would say, if you're not an attorney, you're not a GI rights counselor, it's good to tell people, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not trained in this, but there are people out there who are, and can I help you get to those folks? And when we talk and share about our thoughts and whatnot, just making it really clear, like, hey, this is me. This isn't professional advice. And also being very clear what we actually know and don't know. And often, unfortunately, these cases, there's a lot we don't know. William mentioned she may have stop loss as an issue. That's a very good point in certain situations. Okay, Raleigh asks, does applying for CO defer orders while it is being considered by the Army? Are there other actions a person can take to delay long enough to avoid the situation? Those are great questions. I think what we'll do is we'll talk about them though in the context of hypothetical number 3. So the third and our last hypothetical is PV2 Private Second Class Ramon Chavez is a member of the Texas Air National Guard. He has become disenchanted about the morality of the military and its role in the oppression of people around the world. He isn't sure that he's opposed to all violence, but he has said he would, quote, rather die than fight in a bullshit war against brown people, unquote. He has heard rumors that an activation may be coming, but he wants to do something now to start the process rolling for him to be discharged because he does not want to go. So, on the surface, this is obviously a conscientious objection, potentially a conscientious objection case. However, before we jump to that, I would always go back to say we always need to help folks to make sure they know all their options, and this soldier may have some other easier discharge. So we're gonna. My suggestion would be I would begin with probably the GI Rights Hotline as a starting place to sort through all their other issues. Assuming they are not, if we're dealing with these issues of morality, it's still uncertain whether he has a CO claim or not, that he may. And so if in this scenario, we do not have this immediate activation happening in a few days. We have an undetermined amount of time. My own advice is I would immediately send them to CCW, the Center for Conscience and War, because there may be enough time to do a strong conscientious objector claim, and it's a whole lot better to have a strong claim from the get-go than not. However, what if let's say in this case, instead, this service member is facing activation very quickly, like let's say 2 or 3 days, what can be done? And this goes back to Raleigh's question. And the question was, does applying for a CO defer orders while it's being considered by the military? Unfortunately, the answer is no. But the military regulations state that a service member should be given duties that conflict as little as is practicable, I think it's the wording, with their beliefs. Few things about that. One is practicable is not defined under the regulations and the law. Very frustrating point there. Practicable, it's kind of unclear to me. Is it meaning just is it possible? Does it mean it has to be something that's consistent with the unit's military mission? Who knows? It's not defined. One bit of good news for Army cases, though, is that the Army regs specifically state that these duties that conflict as little with that conflict as little as possible with conscience do not involve firearms. So this can help immensely to at least stop certain kinds of activations. It's not saying that the service member won't have to go on the activation, but they might not be carrying a gun. And that was, that's what I had one last week. That's exactly how it played out, is that he was sent on the mission initially, was not carrying a gun. After a little bit, they decided this is stupid and then sent him home. And now we're dealing with it there. But this is so basically though, in an emergency situation, some people have done doing what's called an emergency CO application, which means it's very, very brief. And there's a few reasons for this. Most importantly is anything you submit becomes a part of the record. You don't want anything bad that's going to hurt you later on the CO claim being heard. At the same time, we don't want the command saying, oh, this isn't really a CO application. You haven't said enough. We're kicking it out. You go pick up your gun and go. So my suggestion in those kind of scenarios, again, talk to someone who's done this before, ideally CCW and some others. But it would be my suggestion to keep the application very, very brief, and as much as possible, just hammer away very briefly at this point on the key elements of conscientious objection. So sincerity, opposition to all war, not necessarily all violence, but to all war. Sincerity, opposition to all war, due to either reasons of religion or reasons of deep conscience. And what I share with my atheist and agnostic clients is I ask them, what are the values in your life that work for you the way a religious person's values work? In other words, what are the values that help you to know right and wrong, that help you to sort out the big things? Anyone has those values, whether you're religious or not. And finally, opposition to all war that began after enlistment. Anyway, those are the 4 essential elements. If that can be addressed very briefly in a short conscientious objector application, that may provide some level of protection after that. However, that will not be the whole thing. This is just the starting point. In a good CO claim, you often supplement it. In this case, in an emergency situation, you definitely would be. So in this emergency kind of scenario, the next step is, even if you're working with someone there's drafting this emergency application, now the real work begins over the next weeks and months to draft the final thing. Okay, we got some more good comments here. Let me read these. And by the way, from here on out, we're kind of moving more into discussion mode. So if you want to unmute yourself, that's fine. But I just wanted the hypotheticals, we kind of use them as a starting point for the conversation.
James?
Yes.
James, I wonder if we might give Siri a few minutes to talk more about the GI Rights Hotline, since that's come up several times, and then we can move into the general discussion and Q&A with you as well as the other panelists. Siri, are you ready to go? Looks like you're on mute.
No, I'm ready to go. But I would like to invite Steve and Lenore from Quaker House, which is also on the GI Rights Hotline. Somebody who hasn't spoken yet, if they want to talk a little bit about the hotline. And if you don't, that's fine. But if you do, jump in.
Hi, this is Steve. I don't know. I think what I'd say here, when someone calls me on the hotline, I don't really know ahead of time what I'm going to be telling them or have a plan or anything like that. So normally, I think this is true for most counselors, normally we're talking to the person about what they want, what their plan is, what they're hoping to get. And then it's kind of a case-by-case thing of then looking at what sort of options we know of that might, listening to possibilities they mention, and then looking at options that might get them what they're after, going over them, those options with them, and just giving them the space to see where they want to go with that and ask more questions. If there's someone who would really benefit from resources in a group like this, we'll certainly tell them about, hey, there's a group that supports people doing what you're thinking of doing and things like that, and get them in contact.
One thing that might be worth mentioning too is that the GI Rights Hotline is a network of local groups. And so, for instance, one of the big advantages of the hotline is that if there are local nodes of the network in local areas that may be very close to military posts and can do more involved things. For instance, Ann Cowan, who's on the call, who spoke on behalf of CMRN, she's also a GI rights counselor right by Fort Riley, Kansas. And so very recently, I had a need of someone to get something to a soldier on post who couldn't leave post. I called Ann, she made it happen. I know that we have the Quaker House that's near Fort Bragg. We have CCW right in the DC metro area with all of those posts. And so that's another thing to kind of be thinking about, particularly for activists, for all of you who are on this call. One thing we can always be doing, even especially when the crisis isn't hot, is looking for local resources. Finding local people we can connect folks with in various situations.
Yeah. If I could just jump in for a second. So, and I would also say that that it's very important in the case of a conscientious objector case or any of cases that are really complicated and that somebody's going to need support over time, to get in touch with the hotline, with CCW, with somebody who's going to be there for you. If you are counseling folks, like if you're with About Face or you're with Vets for Peace and they're calling you up, and then certain things that you can tell them right off the bat is, number one, keep track, document everything that's happening to you.
Mm-hmm.
Write down your thoughts, write down what people are saying to you, get that, because then the next person you talk to, when you're sent to the GI Rights Hotline, you're going to be further down the road. You're going to have thought of some of the things that you want to talk about. Plus, it is always important when dealing with this stuff afterwards that people have mitigation, that they have evidence. And that can be used, when it's important in trying to figure out if this is an illegal order. You have to ask, you can ask your command, is this a direct order? I mean, and I was reading something else today, which I recommend. It was a article or a report from Civil. It's a civilians, I can't remember, and I will be happy to forward it to us later, but it was just talking about from the perspective of National Guard, when they are obliged, for example, to refuse a direct order, and also who should they go to report if they see police committing a crime. I mean, in this instance, there are so many things and so many ways that people on those hotlines, that peer-to-peer support can be really helpful, and a great way to really help funnel people in directions of legal assistance, of having a counselor, of somebody to help you write your CO. But there's also a lot to be said for people who are taking those initial calls, So we should all think about this as something that we're doing together, and we're gonna send people in the direction that's going to be most helpful to them.
Along those same lines, Jerry asked an important question. He said, what if they say they really want to take a stand? How do we clarify that and support their resistance? Who would like to fill that one?
I mean, one of the things we do is we talk with them about what the regulations are, what the potential consequences would be, you know, so that they are understanding what risk they will be taking if they decide to refuse orders or refuse deployment or things like that. And of course, you know, we should get them in touch with Courage to Resist. But one of the things I wanted to mention a minute ago in terms about documentation, you know, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is cell phones. Everybody has cell phones, and it's not just for, you know, recording the police, but if you're having this conversation with your command about an illegal order, you know, get your phone on and be recording the conversation so you can prove that you questioned the legality of the order.
On recording things generally, I will mention, always have people look up whether their state is a one-party or two-party state. That's an important legal distinction. Most states are one-party states. I know Oklahoma, Texas, most I've looked up lately are. A few are not, including California, and I believe Illinois are two that are not. In those states, it's against the law to record, say, your commander without your commander knowing about it. You have to say, I'm recording you. In the majority of states, you do not have to do this. By the way, I've also checked the federal side. The federal side pretty much echoes, it defaults back to state law on this. And so that's one thing I would say. Many service members do use their cell phones to record, and that's great, but just have them check and find out. If they're in a state that's a state where they're not allowed to do that, then taking detailed notes is even more important.
Dan here. In regard to somebody who wants to take a stand, actually during the Iraq-Afghan war, I was working on people that were working on the city to create a GI sanctuary city. So, I mean, there's some things that people can't do alone. We need to start building things that are supportive for them. So if we can create a sanctuary, GI sanctuary city, sanctuary state, because we were having police that were picking up AWOL and turning them over to the military. And we were saying, no, they can't do that, just the same way we'd have sanctuary for immigrants. So that's another thing that people can look at. And in one of your scenarios, when you were saying she was given the order that she had to do it within 4 days, let her command know that they needed to report. I was wondering about what has happened in the past where officers didn't give that order. They didn't send that to people. They were actually protesting in other ways. So, you know, I know that they would be facing something, but, you know, if you got sick and you just forgot to do it and missed the day or accidentally chose the wrong day for them to show up, that could be a way of resisting.
Mm-hmm. I'll mention that on the resistance side of things, I do suggest that there's three big issues. One, of course, is just informed consent. Someone who's deciding to the right, they know what they're getting themselves into. Secondly, it is if they choose to go that path, they need peer support. And that's why I'm really a big fan of connecting people with About Face for that reason. And then finally, I strongly, for those who are trying to go public in that kind of way, working with Courage to Resist makes a lot of sense. Just because you have people there who know PR, who know media, who know how to be effective in that, but are also willing to work with the legal team to make sure that the service members' agenda and the legal side of it and the PR, it all works together. And so in those cases, I really see them as a partnership. Okay, I know Siri raised her hand, and I think someone else. Siri, you want to go ahead? Oh, Siri, you're muted. Let me unmute you. Okay, you're unmuted.
So I think all of those that About Face and Veterans for Peace are going to want to be in support of such people. We have to do it all together. So I know that those other veteran voices who are going to come behind and support them, plus every one of us who will want to be, you know, material and emotional support. So that's something that makes our community really important, that we can do that stuff together.
Thank you, Siri. Raleigh, let me unmute you if I can.
I don't know if it's working.
Okay, there you go.
Hi, thanks for letting me listen to this. It's interesting to learn all this stuff again. And I'm sure it's not the same for National Guard as it is for the military, and I'm sure it's not the same as it was in 1969. As far as a person who wants to resist, I think people have already mentioned, to look at it as a collective thing. How well do you know your unit? And do you think there are people in your unit that really are feeling the same way as you? And how would you find that out? And this, of course, with the warning that anything you do is liable to disturb them and might provoke a response to you. Are you willing to take that risk? These are the risks that are possible. But also, you're very powerful. You're in a unit of National Guard, and you're a powerful voice because a lot of people agree with you, whether you know it or not. You won't know it until you go out there. So I would say very positively to you know, if you're aware of the risk, you know, don't be afraid of your fellow National Guards people. Don't be afraid of doing this. The Army has a history. There's a history of resistance in the military. It stopped the war in Vietnam. Don't be afraid of that history. Thank you.
Well, we have about 10 minutes left, so in our remaining time, I wanted to ask, as we're thinking about this training coming up next week, and it will probably be Tuesday afternoon, if there are any specific topics that folks would like, and again, this is geared more towards attorneys and GI rights counselors, but if there are any specific topics folks would like to have presented, certainly you can share them now or share them with me later. But also wanted to hear, are there specific needs in your community with regards to this kind of outreach, these kind of, and just what else could we do to support each other? So.
James, I just like to share, Courage to Resist for the last week or so has a defense fund that we've set up, and we raised a few $1,000s. It's not a whole lot, and as you know, legal expenses can be many thousands of dollars. But if people on this call, you know, run into a problem of an attorney who really does need, you know, some retainer money or something, you know, please reach out to us so we can help with that.
And I'll just mention for the attorneys on the call, Courage to Resist is really good to work with. I've never felt like that as an attorney that there are any big surprises. It was a very collaborative, cooperative arrangement. So I know attorneys, some are nervous about working with activist groups, but I think I'm a fan of working with them.
Question. What about having speakers talk to young lawyers that are in school that could be working on GI Hotline? They have Lewis and Clark School here where we did have somebody working on GI Hotline before, but I think that's kind of fallen through.
That is a huge, huge need. I'm hoping, actually, I'm making a note here that we need to get the word out to law students about the training coming up next week. I know the National Lawyers Guild, there is a law students section of that, so we can get the word out to law students. Again, the training we're doing next week really is not meant, though, to be a standalone. It's really meant to be more of a follow-up training for someone who's already doing this. But in time, I know that in conversation with Siri and others, I know that there are some opportunities for folks to get full-blown GI rights training at times, but it's also the infrastructure of the network itself. There's some challenging dynamics to it. But I think law students, I know that one of the possibilities, I know that the San Francisco Bay Area, the Bay Area Military Law Project is part of the Guild. I know that they're working to try to get a law student internship program going. Matthew Rinaldi, I think, was on the call. I don't know if he's connected now or not, but I know he's been working with that.
Jane Kaplan also.
Jane, yes, Jane Kaplan. So there are some efforts underway. One challenge I see, though, is that when there have been efforts, they've been pretty far away from military communities. So I would really, really love to someday see a law student program that was down in Texas or North Carolina or Georgia. That does not exist right now, but that's something I'd like to see happen someday.
And I know we have a few people on the call, on the phone, excuse me. Is there anybody on the phone who has a question they would like to add? We've been reading off questions from the chat box here.
I thought I saw a hand raised. Melanie.
Oh, yeah. It's not a question. I just wanted to introduce myself. My name's Melanie, and I'm the new admin manager for Courage to Resist. So I've been doing this job for a whole week now. And so I just wanted to put a face to my name if you get some emails from me. And thank you for letting me join this call so that I can sort of start to see faces to the names of the people in our network as well.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Welcome to this group.
Thank you.
By the way, I'll mention too that tonight we've been talking on chat, been talking to one law student, and I know that I think there's some opportunities there. I also know of at least maybe a few different Guard members who are tuned in tonight. So we have had a very diverse audience tonight, and really appreciate everyone who's tuned in. I will mention that the recording to this will hopefully be ready and online maybe tomorrow. And also the resources page, as you all come across resources that should be shared in this kind of context, please send them to me. We'll keep adding those to the shared Google document. Well, before we, I think we're about out of time. Is any last remarks from anyone? Oh, William, yes, let me unmute you. Oh, go for it.
Well, back a couple years back when we did Schools of America in Mexico, very kind of an excellent little one-page ad to address to the Guard and Reserve troops on Davis Mountain that were deployed to the border. And I wanted to ask, this is really an excellent page we put out. I went on DM and I paper bombed. I went and it passed out 150 to 200 flyers in the process. But I wanted to ask if we can adjust this page, this thing that Veterans Peace put out, not to address the border, but to address Black Lives Matter. You know, the wording and everything could be changed. But I need to ask if that's okay. Can I do this?
William, just send me
Pete,
send me
this is
a
Jerry
draft.
Condon, and I think that sounds like a great idea. Go ahead.
I just got to say,
Go ahead, Garett.
William, go ahead and make the edits and send me a draft. We can work on it together.
I'll do that. Yeah, thank you, Garrett. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you everyone so much for tuning in. What we have also, everyone who registered, I do have email addresses and whatnot there. If you check the box, you like information on future trainings, I will email you about the Tuesday trainings in case anyone's interested in that. And also, if we come across anything else where just this kind of networking among activists who are doing on-the-ground organizing of various kinds, we can certainly do something like this again. So just let us know. And I think everyone, I will go ahead and share my email address in case folks don't have it. Let's see here. And other than that, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, James. Good job. Thanks to you and the Military Law Task Force for pulling this together. I think it was very, very useful. Not only all the information and advice that was shared to Q's and A's, but just having all of these people on this call right now is very significant for our cooperation and giving the maximum support to those GIs who decide to resist now or in the future. So good work.
Yes,
thank you.
absolutely.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, James, and everybody. It was really an excellent conversation tonight. I'm really glad I took the call and I'm on. So thank you so much.
Night, everyone.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night, folks.